Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture in our Out in the World lecture series here at EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum in Dublin. Tonight, you're joining us for Frank's story, Family Histories of Ireland's LGBTQ plus diaspora. And your host tonight will be my colleague, Dr. Maurice Bracken. Casey. Maurice, thanks.
Hi everyone. We've two Maurices at Epic, so I'm Maurice Casey, as Nathan mentioned. So thank you for tuning into this talk, which is both part of the Dublin Festival of History and part of our programming here as part of our new exhibition Out in the World, Ireland's LGBTQ plus diaspora. So this talk is one that I've been really looking forward to, and it's quite a unique talk in a sense. Certainly, it's the first time I've done something like this, which is doing something in front of an audience that I really love to do in my research, speaking to the descendants of people from history. To give you a sense of the structure of the talk, first I'm going to kind of frame the discussion a little bit, then I'm going to introduce you to my co-panelist, and then after myself and my co-panelist Tiernan talk for a while, I'd love to have some participation from you, the audience. So please, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the chat box below, and then they'll be forwarded to me and I can pose them to us here. So let's begin. I'm just going to bring up some slides so that we have some visuals. So the research that I work on is quite contemporary history. Even in the case of my PhD, which was on the interwar period, I found people with living memory of the movements and people that I researched. But working on Irish LGBTQ plus history has naturally led me to conversations with people more intimately tied to these histories, people who lived through this history or family, friends, and partners who love those who experienced this relatively recent past. As part of Out in the World, our exhibition, we have a story wall. It's a physical wall where people can write a post-it note sharing their own Irish LGBTQ plus diaspora story, and it also exists online. So people can submit stories online to our website, outintheworld.ie. Not long after our exhibition opened in June, I came across this note, and it's one that I found really moving. The note reads, "Frank Egan was my uncle. He left Galway at 15 and lived with the Brixton Faeries. I'm proud to walk in his footsteps as a queer Irish person. R.I.P. Frank." The reason that I found the note so affecting was that I had coincidentally just been sent a folder of photos from the Bishopsgate Institute in London that portrayed several Irish gay men who had lived together in Squat and Relton Road in the South London district of Brixton in the 1970s and the 1980s. Among that folder of photos, which were taken by the photographer Robert Workman, was this image of Frank Egan. And I really love the framing of this photo. Frank Egan's defiant gaze, but also that contrast between Frank's vibrant drag and the wall of police, which seemed to me to evoke an entire history in itself. The photo was enough to make me curious about Frank's story, which is why I was so delighted to find that note. What also struck me about the note was that someone had come to the Out in the World exhibition and not only found their own community history, but also their own family history, and how we find these stories about the Irish LGBTQ plus past and how they are told within families are all ideas that really fascinate me. The intersections of family and LGBTQ plus history provide us with a lot of food for thought and about how we trace the people of the past, who gets remembered, and the importance of telling these stories. With all of this running through my mind, I took to social media and I shared my picture of the note, and I invited the person who wrote it to get in touch with me. And before too long, they did. So now it's time to introduce Tiernan Arnup Egan. Tiernan, you can turn on your camera now and join us. Tiernan is a recent graduate of NUI in Galway. They were raised in County Clare and a family history in Galway City, where they completed their BA degree in NUIG. Since moving to Galway 4 years ago, he has become heavily involved in the LGBT plus community. They're serving as chair of the NUIG LGBT plus Society and as committee member of Galway Community Pride. They've also spent time working as a policy officer with LGBT Ireland and have volunteered for several LGBT plus organizations. He has a keen interest in queer culture, philosophy, and politics, and a passion for storytelling. So, Tiernan, it's great to see you again. How are you getting on?
Good. Thank you for having me and for the wonderful introduction.
No problem. So I guess we'll begin with your story of finding the note. So could you tell me, how did you come to find Out in the World and come upon the exhibition?
It was through a friend of Frank who had been in contact with another person who was featured in the exhibition and just sent me an email saying there's something about the Brixton Faeries in this exhibition if you'd be interested. And I just hopped on a train up to Dublin to kind of see what the story was. And I wasn't really planning on leaving a note. I wasn't thinking about that. And I had forgotten that I had left the note. And it had been some time since completely went out of my head. And I don't really use social media that much. And it was only when a friend sat down with me one night and said, "Oh, yeah, I meant to ask you, did you leave a note by any chance at the exhibition that you went to in Dublin?" And I said, "Yeah, I did. Why?" And he said, "Well, it came up on my Twitter feed, a photo of this note asking for someone to get in contact who had written it. And I know you're doing research on your uncle. So I wouldn't have known if not for my friend asking me if I had left one."
Yeah, so that it was this really interesting convergence, right? Because you had already been doing all this research and you discovered the story. So when we first talked, what I really fascinated me was also your story, which I guess is another step back in our chronology of how this pin triggered a lot of this research for you. So could you tell everyone this story, which I just find amazing?
Yeah. So I accidentally started doing research on my uncle as part of my final year in my degree. And one of the first kind of stories that I came across and really amazed me and connected with me was the kind of the story behind this badge. So I had learned that Frank had lived in London and he was also hugely got into drag and he went to Pride marches. And in the 1980 London Pride March, he attended in full drag in a pink chiffon outfit with a matching hat. And on his hat was a plastic meat cleaver, much like the one depicted in the badge. And it was just a toy one stuck in the hat with fake blood dripping down the side. So he kind of went as a butchered drag queen. And he was walking at the back of the march with the rest of the Brixton Faeries when a policeman approached him and said, "What do you have in your hat? That's an offensive weapon." And he said, "Oh no, it's a plastic toy knife. It's not a real one." So he didn't want to get in trouble, so he just put it in his handbag and kept going. And then shortly after, a second policeman approached him and said, "Can you open your bag?" And he did. And of course, the plastic meat cleaver was in there. And they arrested him for possession of an offensive weapon. And this triggered a domino effect where there ended up being like a protest in the protest towards the arrest of Frank. And eventually a few people were arrested for protesting Frank's arrest. And by the time the word reached the front of the march, people had learned that people at the back of the march had been arrested. And it kind of diverted the whole march to the police station to demand the release of those who had been arrested. And more people were arrested then at the police station until eventually they did release them. So it was successful in that regard. But they all had to have their day in court, and there was trials. They attended the trials in drag, and they made quite a spectacle of it. So there was a lot of coverage in newspapers and magazines and different news outlets. So I suppose that's probably why it was the first story that I found, because of how theatrical the whole thing ended up being. which there was a real like beauty and theatre to it all as well, even though elements of it were very serious and sincere, which I think says a lot about the community as well in that time, in that place, and in Brixton. So that was wonderful.
So let's go back then, I guess, and talking about how did Frank end up in Brixton? How did he end up in this community? And you mentioned in your note that he left at quite a young age. He left at 15.
Yeah. Well, this was the part of his life that I really didn't know anything about. So I knew that he was gay, and then he lived in London at some point, and I really didn't know anything more than that. And so he grew up in Galway, in a quite traditional Catholic home, and he had two brothers, went to Catholic school, and then at around the age of 14, he dropped out and trained as a hairdresser. So at some point, he must have realized that he was gay, and he was born in 1959, and he left in 1975, we think. So he was around 15 or 16. So it was definitely no time in Ireland to be gay, to be honest. So he must have realized anyway. And the story was that he told his mother that he had gotten an interview with Vidal Sassoon for hairdressing in London. And so she gave him the money to go. And so he went, and that was it. But I mean, I was discussing this with my dad, but he was very suspicious as to whether there was any interview at all, or if it was just a really convenient excuse to get out. And after talking to a few of the older people here in Galway, they kind of confirmed how common a way that was for people to get out of Ireland and rural Ireland, because so many people were emigrating anyway for work. So it was very easy to tell people you were emigrating for work and no questions would really be asked. So that's how he got out.
Right. And where he finds himself in London is a really remarkable place as well, right? And he's not the only Irish person who found themselves in this particular place, Railton Road, for those who don't know, which is in Brixton in South London, and in the 70s became a centre of squatting. And it was also where the first one of the first gay community centres in the UK was set up. And there are other people there who may be known to some of the audience, people like Colm O'Cluvaugh, who was a playwright, Jim Ennis, who was very well known for drag performances as Wendy Wattage. And have you had a sense of how Frank found that place, or what meaning he found from being there?
As far as I have understood it from speaking to his friends, he went over and started hairdressing on King's Road, but he didn't know anyone in London, so he didn't have a plan. He just had his hairdresser training to rely on. And at some point he must have made some friends along the way. And a friend of his mentioned him to Julian Howes, who was involved with the Brixton Faeries squat in Railton Road, and said, would you have any room for this kid who's just come over from Galway? He doesn't have anywhere to live. And Julian said, yeah, sure. And a couple of days later, he moved in, and he was there until the squats were like shut down by the council, basically. So it really was a huge part of his life there, and was probably largely his introduction to like queer culture as it was then, and drag, and it was a very creative hub, I think, and he was an artist in his own regard, definitely.
Yeah, and it was of course a real centre of activism as well. I've talked a lot with Terry Stewart, who lived there also, who remembered Frank and was also prominent in terms of the activism there on Railton Road. I just want to point out for people tuning in who may be able to see it, I don't know if it will come across in the YouTube video, but in this photo, Tiernan noticed this, but I only noticed it today. Frank is actually wearing the badge with the meat cleaver in the pink triangle, and it's just above his left hand with the ring on it. But yeah, I thought that was amazing that he's wearing the badge. You came across that badge first before you knew Frank's stories.
Yeah. So I didn't realize at the time, but in 2019, so 2 years before I had even thought about doing this research, I had been in Gaze the Word, the bookshop in London. And I remember there being like a wall of badges and pins that had been archived from the 70s, 80s, London Pride marches and things. And I had been taking photos of them. And when I started seeing this badge related to the story of him being arrested and everything, I just kept thinking, why does this badge look so familiar to me? And eventually I found the story that the badges had been rediscovered in an attic in 2018, I think, and then given to Gaze the Word. So it was a bit of luck, the timing that it all happened. So I had actually seen the badge 2 years before I knew that it was at all related to my uncle or anything.
Yeah. And actually, there's a Irish Diaspora story there. I think Tiernan has frozen, but there's an Irish Diaspora story to the. Oh, Tiernan, you're back now. You froze there for a second.
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't know.
Don't worry.
It was
me. But the interesting thing about the badges as well, of course, is that I think we were talking about this before. They belong to Podge Hegarty, the rediscovered badges, who was, and that's why they were given to Gaze the Word, because Podge Hegarty was Irish, and he was one of the managers of Gaze the Word as well. So again, it's like when you look at Irish immigration history, the Irish people just appear everywhere in every single sort of cranny. This next photo, I love these photos. So I guess, do you know the stories behind these? What was this event?
Yeah.
And point out who is who as well.
So these photos were taken by my dad. So he was there for the trials and court cases for after they had been arrested. And so this was outside the courts at one of the dates, because there was multiple dates. So this was one of the days. And the first photo is of Jim Ennis and my uncle Frank in the pub afterwards. And there's a lineup of more of the Brixton Faerie crew there in the second photo. And Jim Ennis was also from Galway, and I think they were about the same age and left Galway at about the same age, and both ended up in the Brixton Faeries but didn't know each other before, which I thought was really interesting. And Jim was featured in the exhibition at Epic and did a wonderful drag on stilts, and it was an amazing performer.
I think that's really interesting as well about Jim and Frank not knowing each other before they left, because I think that's something that this looking at Irish LGBTQ plus history through the diaspora angle gives us, which is more geographical scope in terms of Ireland. Like a lot of this history tends to be very urban focused, because those were the centers of activism, whether that's Dublin, Cork, Belfast, or so on. But this gives us a more, looking at these communities like Railton Road, it gives us a kind of an all-island story of these histories and these pasts. Jim Ennis is someone whose story I've really found fascinating. It's also been great to get in touch with Jim's family through this research also. Jim, his drag performances, people can probably find some of them through Google as well, just the images of him like towering above these clubs. There's been a lot of to a degree, there's quite a bit of writing about the Brixton Faeries and the Railton Road squats, and people can also check out a wonderful movie, a short documentary called Strip Jack Naked, which opens with about 10 minutes of footage of the Brixton squats as they were in the 70s and the 80s. Turning then to one thing that you sent me a lot of photos earlier, and it kind of it sticks to a trend with Frank, which is drag seems to have been enormously important to who he was and to his place within the community at that time.
Yeah, I got a sense of that, and he's featured in this book, Men in Frocks, which I actually have here. I managed to track down a copy, which is a really interesting book, and it covers a huge amount of ground in terms of it's men doing drag. There's also trans women in here, and it's I think it's one of 3 books that came out in the 80s that actually talks about trans people, which is really amazing. But Frank is featured on one of the pages, and he talks about drag and the type of drag that he does and why. And he really wasn't, I suppose he wasn't like trying to pass or anything. That wasn't part of why. It was very like performative, other character kind of element to it, which I think he found a lot of comfort and freedom in, and a lot of power in as well. He spoke a lot about the power of drag for him, and engaging in more of like a gender fuck drag kind of rather than trying to be really pretty and perfect. It was more kind of outrageous and messy, and a bit more like raw and gritty, which was something a bit different as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the term genderfuck is one I kind of encountered for the first time recently as well, but it's kind of a contemporary term in the 80s.
Yeah.
And you can tell it by the term. So that that's kind of, in a way, that was very much a public persona. I guess these photos as well, I just thought they were kind of quite striking photos as well, that kind of speak to what are the story behind these photos? They kind of suggest a kind of a private life of Frank in contrast to the drag persona.
So these were taken by Frank's friend Sarah Lee Lewis, who's a photographer, and she very kindly sent me on loads of photos that she had of Frank, and this was his bedroom in the squat, and him on his bed, which was so nice because it was so intimate. And I suppose because she was such a close friend, she had just really lovely photos that were of him in a very kind of relaxed setting. And I had really never seen my uncle like this at all before, so I was really like fawning over these photographs. To see him looking so like young, happy and healthy was amazing. And she was really kind and sent on a lot of photographs and told me kind of her experience of him. A lot of the most valuable parts of the research came from just speaking to his friends and getting their perspectives on who he was and who he was to them.
And I guess all of what you said there raises so many things for me, because I think that what's so interesting about family history, the kind of attraction of shows for Who Do You Think You Are is precisely this idea of how family history and this research is really a journey, and it's about discovering who you are through your ancestors as well. And it can be really just fascinating to look at different kind of sources. And for you, your sources were Frank's friends, right? Mainly. What else have you kind of looked at to piece together who Frank was?
It was largely what I could find in terms of like newspaper coverage. He was in a couple of books, a magazine, a video, which is YouTube, and hugely photographs that I couldn't struggle to track down the context of them, but all of that combined painted a completely different picture for me of who my uncle was, and in comparison to how I knew him.
And was it a kind of what did Frank's friends say about Frank, and was there a kind of a coherent picture that emerged, or did he come across as a kind of a contradictory character from?
Yeah, I think he was a very complex person who had a lot of struggles, and I always knew, because I knew him as a child, that he relied a lot on substances and he was an addict. But it was interesting to talk to his friends, who all brought that up as well, from knowing him when he was a younger man, and saying he was always a heavy drinker, and sometimes he was a bit of a monster when he drank, and he could be really scary as well, which all kind of confirmed my experience of him. And they were very good in painting, a more realistic depiction of him, and I asked them not to sugarcoat it and don't be worried about upsetting me, because I knew from my own experience of him what he could be like. And so I really appreciated their honesty in that regard. And he definitely did rely hugely on alcohol and drugs. And I think he always struggled in that regard. And I can completely understand why, given his upbringing, and he could never, be out to his parents, or his life in Galway was so different. And to leave at such a young age as well, and completely start your life again in a completely new context, which so many Irish people did.
Yeah. And that's what I found so fascinating about Frank's story, just how the story speaks to so many different kind of forgotten aspects of the Irish immigrant experience that were common to a lot of people. And one of them, I think, that hasn't been talked about enough in how we think about Irish immigration history is what Frank experienced in the 80s, which is HIV and AIDS and its impact on the London Irish community. I'm wondering how much you came across the story of how Frank experienced all of that.
Yeah. I think the best way that it had been again.
Oh, you're back.
Oh, I'm back.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
The best way that it had been. Oh no, was it feeling?
You're just kind of slowing. There's like a slight tech hiccup. Am I
okay?
I think you're good now.
Okay, I seem to be back.
Yeah.
Yeah. The best way that it had been described to me, about how it impacted Frank, was that everyone had began to really slow down in terms of like the partying and a fast-paced lifestyle, because it obviously hit the community so hard. And put an amazing amount of strain and fear on individuals' mental health as well as and he really wasn't interested in slowing down in the way that other people were, and he really struggled to cope with the loss and the fear at the time.
And he eventually made his way back to Galway, right?
Yeah, so I think from my understanding, from talking to his friends, by the early 90s, he was really like struggling in a massive way with the loss. And he returned back to Galway, which would not have been an easy decision. I think he had really pushed himself away from a lot of his friends in London and people he knew from the Scots. And he had started relying on much harsher drugs, and falling in with wasn't very healthy for him. And to decide to return to Galway also meant, recloseting a lot of his life. He moved back in with his parents after living such an independent queer life, and having to, not be able to share any of who he really was with them. So I think he would have been in a very desperate place to have brought himself to do that.
And you showed me a very evocative letter that he sent from Galway. And I was wondering if you could just talk us through it. I read it and I just found it very affecting, because you do come across these as a kind of a genre of letter, which is the returned emigrant writing about what it's like to settle back in. But this is a totally unique example of this kind of a letter.
Yeah, so I had discovered through speaking to his friends that there had been a Facebook page set up for Frank, where people had posted lots of photos and videos that they had. And one photo that had been posted into the page was a picture of this letter. And gave me such a clear look to and this, I think this was only 3 years before he died. And yeah, he was 46 and he died when he was 49. And I think the interesting thing is he talks about, you know, his love life in Galway and getting older, and says, but I console myself with great friends and copious amounts of drugs and alcohol, not a bad exchange of 46. And I think that was very poignant for me because, you know, he said it himself and out loud that that's how he's coping. So he knew, you know.
Yeah. So Frank died at 49. So he died young, but you still had a chance to get to know him. How old were you when he passed away?
Yeah, so I would have been around 11 when he died. So kind of young, but him. Yeah, this is a photo of my mom, me and him. So I would have been about 1 or 2 in that photo, I think 2, when he was back in his parents' house in Galway. I knew such a different version of him, and this was why a lot of the research was really a shock to the system for me, because my view and experience of him was quite negative, and I was always fairly withdrawn from him and kept my distance. And after his death, you know, I heard snippets that I knew he was gay and he lived in London and that. I suppose to learn on his 13 years after their death is a strange grieving process, you know, a decade on for someone that I didn't know I shared a community with decades apart, and that our lives are strangely connected in a very distant, twisted way. And we never kind of got there, you know, our lives never overlapped, and we could never really even understand my queer identity at that age. And he was, you know, naturally just withdrawn and not there because he was so reliant on substances and alcohol. So it was trying to grieve what was and what could have been.
Yeah. And why do you think it's been important for you to do this research? What has kind of compelled you to continue it and to?
Yeah, I think, well, I at so many points I thought I was finished. And then another thing would kind of come up, and originally I just did a very short kind of 10-minute presentation piece for, along with like an essay and whatever, for a class in NUIG, and kind of thought, okay, well, that's done, I suppose. And then I would be contacted by, you know, another one of his friends, or I would find out another story or another piece of information would come back to me. And then, you know, I found the Epic exhibition, and then I got to talk to Jim Ennis's nieces. And so the research just kind of never let go of me, in a sense, which has been really enjoyable to get along.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. There's a few tech difficulties, Tiernan, and maybe on your end or my end, but it's fine. I can hear you, but sometimes you kind of tune out a little bit, but don't worry. I can hear you okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. That's the nature of these things. So, yeah, I mean, what to me is so striking about Frank's story, and I think why it's important to tell these histories of complicated figures, of complex people, because I think that it's you know, the Irish LGBTQ plus past, which since 2015 for sure there's been a much greater, more public awareness of it, but it still can be reliant on stories of figures like Oscar Wilde or Roger Casement or Kate O'Brien. But it's great that there's a greater diversity, a greater complexity in the stories that are told, both in terms of the history, but also in terms of culture as well, and these representations. I wanted to invite now audience questions. Anyone's free to chime in or whatever they'd like to, comments they'd like to make or questions they'd like to ask. Tiernan, I guess, what do you think? Let me think. How would I phrase this question? What do you think that stories like Frank's add to our picture of Ireland's LGBTQ plus past? What kind of themes do they suggest? What makes them important to share?
I think what was interesting for me during the research was how much his story reflected other people's experiences, and how similar a lot of other Irish immigrants had it, and the circumstances and the timing. And it was a story, you know, of an Irish person who was an immigrant, who was gay, who was a drag artist, who was, you know, a hairdresser. He did escort work for some time there, and there were so many elements that told a story that people, you know, could relate to in terms of like his peers, because there were so many Irish people in the squat. And what was interesting, when I was talking to Julian, he was saying how there was, you know, people from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland who were both living in the squat, and at a time when that conflict was really heightened and intense, they found like a real peace away from it in the squat, because it really wasn't like a prevalent conflict then, which was a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about until Julian had mentioned it to me.
Mm-hmm. And thinking as well in terms of the differences between Frank's emigration and his experience and his identity in the 70s, 80s, and yours now, what do you see as the kind of major differences between the kind of Irish queer identity now and in the 70s and the 80s?
Sorry, I think you cut off
a
bit there for me.
I was talking about what do you see as the major differences between your generation's experiences in terms of queer identity and Irishness and Frank's?
I did not catch that. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
I think it's my internet.
No, don't worry. So the question I was asking was differences between your generation in terms of queer identity and Irishness and Frank's. What do you think are the major ones? Have you lost me again?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think that was also an element of the research, was because I'm a queer person who is in Galway, and so was he. And the time difference between when we've been, you know, living our lives here as queer people is really not that far apart at all. But our lives are completely different, and our opportunities are so different. And that was something that struck me so much, and made me appreciate so much what he had to go through that I don't have to go through. And, you know, if I had been born at a different time, my life would have been more similar to his in terms of emigrating and having to live, I suppose, more as like a deviant in society than I do now. And that struck me immensely. And he couldn't really be like a queer person in Galway as a young person. And even when he was older, it was so different. and that's something that I do not take for granted now.
Again, I'd like to invite any audience comments or questions that may be there. Another thing that I've asked really everyone in the series is, what do you think? What are the sort of frontiers of campaigning in Ireland for LGBTQ plus people? What do we need to work on, and what do we need to really advocate for?
Yeah, it's interesting since I suppose since marriage equality really, not that there's been like entirely a lull, but when there's, build up in a referendum like that, and so much time, work, and energy goes into it, there's always like a breathing period, I think, afterwards. But 6 years down the line, Ireland is a very good place to live as an LGBT person. But saying that, I think there's a lot to happen socially still, as well as around legal changes and things, especially with family rights and trans rights, and more protection and hate crime legislation and elements around there. But like socially a catch up as well. And I think it's interesting because I think sometimes there's a misconception with rural Ireland, and rural Ireland being more kind of behind on the times and more homophobic. And as someone from rural Ireland and the west of Ireland, and currently living in the west of Ireland, what I have experienced more is just a lack of resources and a lack of education, rather than just people, being fundamentally more conservative. And that's really not the case. It's that a lot of the education and the money that it takes to educate people just doesn't get funneled far enough out and away from Dublin and other major cities. And it's a shame because it kind of doesn't ever give smaller rural communities a chance. And there are amazing pockets of incredibly supportive people in smaller towns around Ireland that I don't think people really give them enough of a chance, which is a shame.
Yeah, I think that the rural community groups, and there are some amazing rural activists who do incredible work, like yourself. What Galway, I guess, has a good support basis there. There's a question. I'm curious. So this person says that they're curious to know whether you think it's harder to find Irish lesbian histories than it is to find Irish gay histories. What do you think, Tiernan?
Well, I think in the context of Galway, it's interesting because Galway Pride was founded by, it was majoritively lesbians who founded the helpline here, Galway Pride, and like their straight friends, and they really struggled to get gay men like involved in terms of like the organization side of it, and like, oh, let's get resources in the Pride and let's set up things. So that was really interesting. So a lot of the Galway queer community history I associate largely with the lesbian community, and that's how I've experienced it. But that doesn't mean it's across the board. I know more about Galway than anywhere else, really. So I'm not sure in terms of Irish emigrants what that side is like. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's whether we're asking the question whether it's hard to find them represented publicly, or whether it's hard to find them in the sources. I guess represented publicly, perhaps there is less attention or public knowledge of Irish lesbian history. Part of that is a quirk of the legal history, whereby the law criminalized only male sexuality. So the law mobilized chiefly against that the legal campaign focused on that in a way. But I think now that there's huge effort in terms of making sure that the narrative is balanced and that the sources are balanced. And I think that whether you're topic when you're going into research this history is lesbian history or trans history, or whether it's immigration history. When you adopt the lens, you'll find the sources because they are there. Like it's a case of speaking to people, going into the archives of the Irish Queer Archive or the Cork LGBT Archive, which are all run and curated by people who are very aware of making sure that history is balanced and represents all of the community across the whole community. So another question, Tiernan, for you that came from the audience is, did Frank seek help for depression or have suicidal issues? Sounds like his self-medicating with drugs, alcohol was his process.
Yeah, largely. I did come across a letter at one point that had been sent to my parents after I think he got out of some sort of clinic. So I think there was like small attempts, but I don't think he ever wanted to try that much. And that's the sense that I got from the letters that I saw and the pieces of writing, which is a great shame. And I think he was very ashamed in a lot of ways, even though he was very out and very gay and doing drag. But internally, I think he struggled a lot with his sense of like self-security in himself. And that's a more like core problem, I suppose, that gets, kind of poked at and prodded at by external issues. Yeah, that's as far as I know.
Yeah. And there's a comment from Richard O'Leary, and he says, thank you so much, Tiernan, for such a moving and informative talk.
Thank you.
So Richard had also shared with me that the article I showed you earlier from.
Oh, yeah, great.
So if there's any more comments, please do let us know, but we can kind of start coming to a close, I guess. I've just really, when me and Tiernan first spoke, I just knew that I really wanted to do this event because I found this story so moving. And I know Tiernan spoke to me about how when you've been speaking to your friends, they've also been kind of, captured by the story as well. I think that there is just something about Frank's story that really draws people in.
Yeah, I think it was very emotional. It's been kind of half a year now since I was doing the research, but I couldn't get off of my laptop for I think like 5 days. I didn't do anything else. I just sat at my laptop and Googled and researched about Frank, and I couldn't believe the things that I was finding about an uncle who I had such a negative association with. And I think at the time in my life, I really needed to see myself in someone, and to find it in an uncle that I really didn't know that I had was really powerful for me anyway, personally. There's a difference when you have other queer people in your family. There's, I don't know, a special connection, I suppose, and a particular understanding of where you're coming from and your experience. And most queer people don't know of other queer people in their family, maybe one or two. As it turns out, I have a quite queer family somehow, but I think to see my friends' reactions to the story, and they've all said to me, "You're so lucky." And that's really interesting to me, where they crave having someone in their family who they can have that more understanding connection with, because so many queer people are so disconnected from their families, and there's a real difficulty in understanding each other sometimes. And that was really interesting, and that's what made me think maybe I should talk to people or do some more research on it, because I wasn't sure if I was going to. And that really reassured me that if it not only meant something to me, but meant something to my friends who were also hearing the story, and they were also amazed that there was something more there that was meaningful beyond me.
Yeah. And I think that all of what you've just said there just says so in such an articulate way, really why I think it's important to share these stories. And I think it's just wonderful to learn of you moving from what you term this negative attachment to, through researching Frank's story and fleshing it out, it being something so meaningful. I think that is, it really demonstrates the power of this history and the power of telling these stories and the importance of telling them. So I can't really think of a better note to kind of leave us on. So I'd really like to kind of thank firstly Tiernan enormously for sharing the story. I really appreciate you sharing the photos and all of this research. It's just fantastic. And also, of course, to thank everyone who's tuned in, particularly those of you who made a donation when registering to Shout Out, who are the charity partner for this series. Really appreciate all of those who tuned in. We do have one last question that has come in from Anthony Russell, so I'll ask because I appreciate Anthony asking a question. And he writes, assuming church intolerance was a factor in Frank's emigration, in your experience, is the Catholic Church now more accepting of LGBTQ?
That's interesting. I actually wasn't raised Catholic, so I've had an even more different experience. Frank went to the Jes in Galway, which is a Catholic school, and his mother was very, very religious. And she was very disapproving of me. My parents weren't married when I was born, and even that was like really pushing it for her, and that was still the late 90s. So that's an idea of how traditional her values were and how devout she was to the church, and really believed that they could do no wrong, and turned a blind eye to a lot of the scandals that were coming out. And yeah, I was raised so far away from it, and I really appreciate my parents doing that for me and protecting me from that. So it's hard for me to say personally and to compare it. I don't know. I don't know of any friends of my generation who are queer and still like practicing Catholics. A lot of them have battled with Catholic guilt and their experience growing up, and being raised Catholic and going to church and all the rest, and how it was still a foundation of Irish culture even for my generation in our early mid-20s. So I know from their experiences that it didn't just vanish. It's still a problem for my generation. Yeah.
There's another question that's coming. People are less shy now that I've told the headline.
Yeah.
And it's from Dermot Bratnock, who asks, did your father support him read the court case? Though I suppose we could ask, did the family know about the arrest in the court case?
Yeah, so my dad did. So my dad, who is great, he was very supportive of Frank and is very supportive of me, and probably a lot because of Frank and having been exposed to queer culture and queer people and different ways of living and being and existing in the world. And he didn't see Frank for, I think, 3 or 4 years after he left, and then went over to London to visit. And that's probably when he started being more exposed to the community as well. And he went to all of the court cases, took photos. They lived very nearby. My dad lived in Brixton as well. So my dad would have known a lot of the people who Frank knew as well in the Brixton Faeries. So that was a really wonderful experience for me. And also a moment for me to turn around and ask my dad why on earth he had never told me about any of this. And it was very much me kind of asking more questions from him and saying, well, you were there, and he had one of the badges as well, which he kind of mentioned offhand, and I was like, do you still have it? I mean, Come on, Dad, give me more info. This is gold. Yeah.
That's great. So we're running out of time. So I will finish up on the last note, which is a comment from Richard Wolfe, which I think is a fitting one to end on. And Richard notes, thanks so much for sharing his life, a great example of how important individual stories are in history. I absolutely agree. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope to see you at another event soon. And Tiernan, hope to see you soon. And thanks so much for joining us. Bye, everyone.